So I think the last one kind of speaks to the idea that, wow, there are folks who are just like us, different complete backgrounds, who are really interested in understanding these issues in a bigger picture and who value my opinion actually on the issues. From the outside student's perspective, some of the most fascinating, especially for the female students in my class, were the talks around, wow, I'm not scared anymore to walk down the street. Because this is, especially on university campuses, kind of so driven that as a white woman even, that you are to be very fearful of, particularly men of color, walking down the street. And so one of the person talked about how it changed her views, that she was more aware and change in education opportunities. Oh no, wait, that wasn't the one I was going to say. Oh, I'm not as fearful of street crime as I used to be. It's been full of emotional experiences and a roller coaster of rides. The second one's pretty good too. It's made me more open and accepting and aware. I learned just as much about myself as I did the criminal justice system. It was the one place where everyone was real and honest for a change. All of the social stigmas we hide behind were stripped away. We all found honesty and acceptance in the most unlikely place. So even in the university classroom, when I try to hold these critical discussions, there's very much peer pressure in the university, and so folks don't even feel comfortable in those settings being able to share their true thoughts and feelings on a matter based on experiences or based on ideas that they've read before. Okay. So some of the other kind of bigger picture things are what does it do for the prison system? And quite frankly, there was a lot of work initially that I had to do to get in, even though I already had the relationship to do the class. And one of the things that I just said, I think, I don't remember who was saying that earlier about the abolition conversation, of you have to have certain things that you're not going to walk away from. So yes, I'm going to work within a system that I don't want to be in, right, or that I don't want to exist in this fashion. But there's certain things I'm not going to give up on, and one of mine was that there was not going to be a correctional officer in my classroom. And so if that was going to be the case, then I wasn't going to be teaching the Inside Out class at that prison. We would have found a different arrangement. And that was a very difficult one. They expected for me to, the warden and some of the assistants expected that the first time they said, well, that's just not going to happen, for me to say, oh, okay. And I was like, well, I guess I can't teach the class. I don't feel comfortable that we can have the kind of dialogue that needs to take place in a comfortable, safe space with a CO in the room. And finally, my persistence, Michael likes to refer to me as a persistence person, paid off, and they trusted me, quite frankly, I think a little bit enough for my relationship that we'll let her try it and see how it goes, and then decide if we want to change the rules. And we let the prison folks do a little bit of talking at the closing ceremony, and that's all they talked about, is how they can't believe that they let me not let have, but my gosh, if you would see how many emails that woman sends a day, and she even emails during Ohio State football games, which is like a no-no in Ohio, it was just not worth the battle. So some things I wouldn't let go of, but others, I actually had to kind of compromise on where the initial setting was going to be. The prison culture, this is becoming more and more interesting to me to kind of understand how does one class kind of affect what's going on inside the prison. And the only thing I can say, I'm new in this process, is that the first time I went, it felt like in some ways the administration was dragging people to come and meet with me, literally. Because you go in thinking you're doing this great thing, and offering something that they haven't had before, and that it'll be a great, wonderful resource for the prison, but that's not how folks are interpreting your presence there. And the only thing I can say is when I went to do recruitment for the fall class, which has to happen a lot earlier now, is that I had 42 men show up to this General Assembly meeting. And now, none of the men who showed up were in Browns, which Browns were the honors folks. It was all from the general population. And I this time had a panel of foremost students, and it was so much more fascinating because, I can go on and on about Inside Out, but, it's so different coming from the students themselves and from the folks who are incarcerated with the men who I was meeting with. So that ended up being a great thing, and unfortunately this time around I had to turn folks away or put them on a wait list to see if they can get in. The other thing that's been going on in terms of growth of Inside Out in Ohio is, I'm not the only one, by the way, who teaches Inside Out in Ohio. We have started to kind of formalize a relationship with ODRC, because if you go individually into each prison to try to do this, it's a lot of work. I mean, 6 months of laying the groundwork just to get your foot in the door, and with the possibility that anybody you're meeting with could say, I don't want to take that class, you know, or I don't want to participate. And so we've formalized the relationship because we've taken advantage of an opportunity, and that is that our director, the new director of the prison system in Ohio, it was actually a staunch Inside Out supporter and was at the prison where it first developed in the state of Ohio. So he was very much on board with Inside Out and has since taken the time to write a letter to every warden in the state at the prison saying, we endorse Inside Out as a program. We're trying to figure out, though, how best to grow it, because as with anything, now they want it in every prison. Well, I mean, that's just not, we don't have enough instructors, and it's a very costly venture, by the way, to my university. It's not something, in this time especially, of budgets, that the university is going to be giving up an instructor every quarter to teach. The university makes no money whatsoever, actually lose money on me teaching the course, because they can make a lot more money by me sitting in a university classroom than taking a bus that I get a grant from the university to pay for up to the prison, and holding class there weekly with a lower number of students than I would have in the university classroom. I'm also piloting a couple of new options. One of the national Inside Out rules is that they do not allow folks who have been convicted of sex offenses in the program, and I found that a very problematic rule for trying to break down the barriers of us versus them, and who's worthy of a deviant offender status and who's not. So there's two things I've been piloting for the national program, and one is I do allow folks convicted of sex offenses in my program, and it's piloting, meaning that, just to show there hasn't been in 15 years an incident, a safety incident of the program at the prison or after, by the way, the courses, but just to kind of show that, it doesn't matter if we, no matter how much control you try to keep over a program, you don't know a lot of information, first of all. And so it's not that we don't have folks convicted of those offenses in the program, it's just that we don't have it on paper saying that they're convicted of those offenses. And the other one is the credit option. My first class, the students did not get college credit for the class, the incarcerated students. And that was really problematic for me, but it was a timing thing. So what I did is this time I'm sending those that were interested. There's 15 men, 13 of them are interested. Applying for continuing education credit at Ohio State. It's not going to be an easy process, and I'm running into all kinds of bureaucratic hurdles, because unlike some of the other universities in the country who are either religion-based or community college-based, it's much more difficult at a big university like Ohio State to get them to look beyond the legal liabilities and all of those things along with it. But we will see what happens, because I think that's an important process for them to do the work, and they're doing the work, by the way, beyond some of the university students, and not to get the college credit is really problematic for me. So I already talked about most of this. There is now, I had to get on quite a few colleagues on the campus outside of my department in positions of power to kind of get on board with Inside Out, to kind of start trying to push a little bit of the culture of OSU. And they're doing some of this work with the Kerwin Institute for Ethnicity and Justice, because, again, I've said this, 1 in 25 Ohioans, and it's disproportionately folks of color in Ohio. And so making it from the standpoint of you cannot any longer ignore this big issue that you have this process for felony applicants, and that's only if you check the box, and then they give no public information about what that process is and how they're making decisions. So because I'm not tenured, though, I have to bring in some other folks with more power and political prestige to do those things. The last thing I'm going to say, because I'm about out of time, is that I'm doing some of the research for the first national research study as a pilot site, because I said that I see all of these things happening, and I see it as an important education initiative for everybody involved, the community, the students, the folks in the who work in the prisons, and the CJ system. But we need more empirical research to kind of suggest what it actually does. You know, it might, in all seriousness, it could be just a feel-good thing that lasts for 10 weeks and has no long-lasting impact. And it might be that it's doing a lot of things that we don't even know about. For instance, the university students across the country have been organizing themselves. So students who have taken Inside Out classes, and all of them are on Facebook, are organizing around certain issues, certain social justice issues. But we don't have any real way of knowing what's occurring in the last 15 years. So I'm doing two different studies, content analysis of reflection papers, and if you look on the abstract, former students, inside student and outside students, are involved in this project as well. And then we're going to do a comparative, because one of the things that has become very evident to me is that I feel like my other students now at the university level, my CJ classes, are getting slighted, because I do not see the deep level of understanding and critical analysis in those classes that I see in these Inside Out classes. So we're doing a comparative pre and post kind of a survey of those two classes, because most of the topics are the same. It's just that it's the pedagogy and the context that differ significantly. To see if some of these specific issues of social policy and advocacy and perceptions of the other and self and the system itself change over time. Let's see, I think the last thing I'm going to say is that, you know, I've said that I'm optimistic, I guess, about Webb's legislation, because it's something that's needed at the federal level to actually do something about what we do in the U.S. I was telling somebody earlier on the news this morning, they were talking about the England playing Slovenia in the cup, and you know that they were at a primary school, and this 12-year-old, they were asking questions about how many people are in Slovenia, and the 12-year-old said, whatever the number was, like 1 point some million, said less people than the U.S. incarcerates, and I thought to myself, my God, you know, I mean, you know, it's amazing at the primary education level. I mean, they know we are the worst example of what can happen in the prison penal system at that level. So I'm optimistic, and I'm hoping that it's not just more research and stuff we already know is occurring, and it actually has policy recommendations and significant reform with more forward-looking towards a movement. Because one of the things that has to shift is the rhetoric and the discourse. It's not, you know, it's not a human rights discourse. It's not an abolition discourse in the U.S. I mean, somebody was saying earlier about collecting yourself amongst other abolitionists. I mean, I don't even know how you do that when you even search the web. I mean, I had never even heard of ICOPA until others had told me about it, because there isn't a web presence. And it is difficult to align yourselves with folks who are doing some of that same work when nobody wants to even put the word out there because it's taboo in the U.S. culture. So I think that education is my way of trying to shift some of the discourse, and actually inclusion. And we don't hear the voices. You know, at every different committee work I'm on that involves the community needs to be at the table. And the community, by the way, of the prisons isn't just folks who are incarcerated. It's victims, it's community members who live in those communities, and community members where those folks are going back to, in terms of trying to shift the dialogue and rhetoric. That's all I'm going to say. Thanks.